Having had a look at what ethics is and how it can differ from other standards, we come to a third conceptual problem when dealing with ethics, one that I think plagues the modern world, and that's ethical relativism. This is probably one of the most philosophical questions we're going to encounter in the subject, and I can understand that it can be a little bit kind of esoteric or abstract for some people. But I do think it's a critical thing for you to think about because the implications in terms of ethical decision-making and what you believe are profound. So when we talk about ethics, we can talk about three different kinds of ethics, right? Three kinds of ethical problems. We can talk about normative ethical questions, which is what most people think. So they're questions about what you should do. So anytime someone is talking about what you should do ethically, they're talking about ethics from a normative perspective. That's very different from descriptive ethics. So descriptive ethics merely investigates or describes ethical phenomena. So for instance, those models that I showed in the first video are descriptive ethical models. They're not telling you what to do. They're trying to describe how people make ethical decisions. If I were to do a survey, how many students inappropriately use AI, and I were to get the numbers behind that, and if 60% of students or 20% or whatever the percentage was, that would be a descriptive ethical question, right? How many students inappropriately use AI? It's not telling you what you should do, it's trying to describe what is. And then there's this third element, a meta-ethical question. They're questions about what ethics is, what does it mean? They're more about philosophy. And this issue of ethical relativism is a meta-ethical question. It's about metaphysics. It's about what you believe. Okay, there's no way to prove it, but you really should be aware about what you believe and the implications of what you believe. So the essence of the problem around ethical relativism is that there are differences in ethical standards in societies. Well, are there differences in ethical standards between societies? That's the question. So it's trying to discern whether there are absolute ethical standards or whether ethics is relative. Does ethics vary with context? Let's have a look. So what we know is that what people have in terms of, or the standards that people have vary by cultural groups around the world. They'll have different standards of etiquette, they'll have different laws, and they'll have different religions. So does it necessarily follow that ethical standards will also vary by the culture that you're in? In fact, it's led many people to argue that what's ethically right or wrong can vary. It can vary depending upon the culture. That is, ethics is relative. For instance, it might be considered unethical and even illegal for women to be educated in country A, whereas women are considered equals and should have full access in country B. An ethical relativist would say that denying women education is ethical in country A, but unethical in country B, because ethics is relative. Now, if you accept this at a cultural level, then there's nothing to say that you shouldn't accept it at the individual level, which means that what's ethically right or wrong might differ depending upon the differences in the individual. This difference in what the right thing to do is can also be called cultural relativism. So let's take a real-world problem from business. Often when entering foreign markets, a business might be asked to pay a facilitation fee to government officials. In essence, it's what we'd consider in Australia a bribe. They don't record it, it's paid in cash, it's not legally required, and it's for a government official. That could be accepted in that culture. While that might be accepted in that particular culture, in the culture of the home executive, it'd be considered a bribe. So now the question is it ethical to pay that facilitation fee? A moral relativist would say, yes, it is, right? It's ethical in that culture, so therefore it's ethical to pay there. But you wouldn't be allowed to pay it in your home culture because it's unethical there, right? So there's no absolute rule should you pay facilitation fees or not. It depends upon the cultural rules that you're in. Of course, that would then extend to the individual, right? Moral relativism could mean that a decision for individual A is ethical, but that same decision for individual B is unethical because ethics or morality is relative. That's the outcome of ethical relativism. You get different decisions based upon the situation alone because what is ethical is variable. It's ethical to pay facilitation fees. It's ethical to bribe people in some cultures. It's not ethical to bribe people in other cultures. So they're really saying the standard varies by culture. Now, at first glance, that can be appealing because we do know that there are differences between cultures, but it throws up some real problems for ethics and the study of morality. In fact, most moral philosophers would suggest that ethics isn't relative. Now, this is going to lead to a little bit of a mind-bending issue. There's a difference between having a different standard and a different expression of that standard, okay? So while the expression of a standard might vary culturally, the standard doesn't vary. That's what a moral absolutist would say, and most moral philosophers would be absolutists. Why? Well, the fact that moral standards vary around the world doesn't mean that they're all right and that morals are relative. For instance, there are some people who believe that the world is flat. That doesn't mean they're right. Just because people believe different things doesn't mean that they're right. And the second major thing is that there can be a misunderstanding about the expression of a particular standard. And so we have here perhaps a traditional practice from the Inuit people of leaving older people to die in the cold if it put the community at risk, is an expression of the standard of looking after the community. The way you express that in that community because of resource constraints and what you could and couldn't do was that you might have to make a very harsh decision for some members of the community. Whereas in a different community where you have resources, etc., looking after the community might actually mean building specialist facilities to look after the elderly who can no longer look after themselves. So what a moral absolutionist would say is you've got to be very careful that you are not mistaking differences in moral standards for an expression, a different expression of the same moral standard that can vary with the context that you're in. So contextual expression of the standard can vary while the standard doesn't. So I'll leave you to think about that. That can be a bit of a hard one to wrap our head around. Because the consequences of accepting ethical relativism can be profound. If you accept ethical relativism, if you accept that ethics varies by culture and by person, then you can never criticise what anyone else or any other group does. You can't morally condemn slavery. You can't morally condemn discrimination based on ethnicity or gender. Why? Because those people can argue that it's ethical from their perspective, from their culture. If ethical relativism is true, you're really only looking at your cultural standards, right? So in a way, you're really starting to mix social norms with ethics, right? What are the cultural standards? What are our social norms rather than what is ethics? And we tried to discern that in the last little video that we talked about. But if you accept this, if you accept that you determine what's right and wrong based upon the social norms or cultural standards, it means that you can't criticise those standards. You can't criticise your society or anyone else's society on moral grounds because that is the standard. And so if ethical relativism were true, then you can't make moral progress, that you can't ethically grow. Because there is no standard to grow to. There is nothing to improve to because there is no standard. So I think I would leave you with that idea about ethical relativism. If you're attracted to the idea of relativism, The consequence is that you can't judge whether someone else is being ethical or not, because it can vary. So if in your thinking you actually judge whether things are ethical or not, other cultures, other people, etc., if you think that way, you must be thinking from an absolutist point of view. Because if you're not, you're really saying, is it aligned with the cultural norms, etc., as part of it? Okay? Now, an ethical relativist might argue about that to some degree and say, no, you can look at complying with the norm within that society. But that's the consequence of moving forward on that someone can always come back and say, but for me, it's ethical for these reasons. So if you don't think like that, you're probably an ethical absolutist. You think ethical standards are absolute. Now, just because you believe ethical standards are absolute doesn't mean that your society's standards are necessarily correct. In fact, it's the opposite. We could probably learn from other people. It probably opens up our society to be more self-critical and work out how we can develop ethically as individuals and as a society. So I think that's one of the real benefits of thinking through this absolutist perspective. Just remember, though, it doesn't mean that you always make the same decision in the same context. The standard that you hold to might express itself differently, but it's still the same standard. That's what the absolutist is arguing. So following on from that, what it suggests is, as business people, it's important to remember that when you're faced with ethical issues in business, it's not exactly the same as what is socially acceptable or what has been socially acceptable in the past. When you're dealing with different people from different cultures, they might have something that they can teach you about ethics and about what is the right thing to do, a different way of looking at the problem. But also, we don't need to accept practices in different cultures if we don't believe that they're truly ethical. So that's one of the benefits. It's about being more questioning about what is the right thing to do from an ethical perspective, particularly when we're in different circumstances, different contexts, different cultures.